Hello, this is going to be the second video about this cougar drawing, and this one will be longer because I wanted to talk about certain things. It does seem like a small, simple sketch, but I think there are a few interesting things going on here which are worth talking about. I don't really like full-length videos, so I will speed it up a little bit, but not too much, because I want to comment a bit on the whole process and talk a bit about things like drawing fur, rocks, backgrounds, and the whole composition. I'm not a very experienced artist, so every drawing is also a learning process for me, and you'll always see me adjusting certain things and changing my mind about certain things in the middle of the drawing progression. Now let's get to it. As you can see, I started out with a graphite pencil, and when I draw with charcoal pencils, I normally use graphite pencils only for sketching. But here I decided to combine graphite pencils with charcoal pencils, and I'm using an HB graphite pencil to draw the background. Now a few words about the background and the composition. My reference photo didn't really have much of a background. It didn't really have much of a sky or any trees in the back or anything particularly interesting. So I decided to draw a vignette with the edges fading into the white of the paper. But I still wanted to have some background, and I decided to put this mountain here in the back. And I thought that a graphite pencil would be a perfect tool for it, because it would allow me to create a smooth, soft, blurry background, which isn't very distracting. And then in the foreground I would use charcoal pencils to draw the cat, which would have a lot more contrast and texture, and would immediately be the focus of the drawing. So I drew something that looks like the mountain with some trees on top in the back. Now I'm moving on to the cat, and I'm using a charcoal pencil. It's a woodless charcoal pencil, a medium one. The medium charcoal pencil allows me to sharpen it more easily and to make more precise, cleaner lines. But it doesn't really blend or spread around as well as the softer one. So it has some advantages and disadvantages. And I started out by drawing the shape of the cougar's head and some of the basic features. One of the first challenges was how to draw the realistic fur. And when we're doing portraits of animals, what you normally do is you try to draw the fur in the direction in which it grows. So you make pencil strokes which vary in length, and you try to make them in the direction in which the fur grows. And because the length of the fur varies in different parts of the animal's body, you also vary the direction of your strokes. However, when you're looking at a furry animal like this from a distance, the short hair in certain parts of the cat's body, you can't really draw it with strokes. It looks almost like dots. So you have to adopt a different approach. What I used was a scribbling motion, and it allowed me to create something that looks like short hair, because the charcoal pencil will naturally produce some texture when you use a scribbling motion, and all you have to do is not blend it in too much, and you will end up with something that looks like short fur. And I needed that short fur around the cat's head and the neck. As you can see, as you move further away from the cat's head towards the body, you will see that the hair is longer. Here I try to draw the whiskers with a pencil eraser, but they didn't really come up too well. I will need to increase the contrast and refine them a little bit until they become a little more visible. Another thing that you can see on this leg that I'm working on is that the fur has these folds or creases. Just like the skin has folds and creases, the same thing happens to the fur around those parts of the body where there are joints, or where the legs or the body bends a lot. So you need these darker areas to show that the fur also has these recesses or these creases. Now I've done most of the head and the front legs, and I'm moving on to the chest and the body. And here also the length of the fur varies, so I'm adjusting my stroke accordingly, because in the top part of the body the fur is shorter, and then as you move further down towards the belly it gets longer and fluffier. Cougars are a very interesting subject to draw. They are, I think, a little bit easier to draw than some other types of big cats, like, for example, leopards or tigers, because, let's be honest, they have spots and stripes, which can take a while to draw. Still, you also have to put in an effort to make the cougar's fur realistic as well, so that also takes a little bit of work. You have to keep in mind that the length of the hair varies. You have to try to make the anatomy of the cat look realistic, and so on. I'm moving on to the back of the cat, and here my strokes are getting a little bit longer. My goal here is to cover this area with these strokes, and it doesn't look like much at this point, but once I start blending it will start to make a lot more sense, I think. Now I'm using a brush, and the brush is a very useful tool for blending, and it is especially useful when drawing hair or fur. Why? Because it doesn't only add value and blends the strokes a little bit, it allows you to leave some of that texture. So if you've made strokes in a certain direction, those strokes will still be visible. They will be softer, they will be blended in, they will look more realistic, like actual hair, but they will still be there. So some of that texture will still be there. Now I'm using the tortillon, and the tortillon blends a little bit differently. It blends a little more thoroughly, because when you use a tortillon, it tends to blend out the texture almost completely. So what you want to do is use the combination of a tortillon and a brush for the best effect, because in those areas where you want to have more texture and you want the texture of the hair to be visible, you will use the brush. In those areas where you want the fur to look softer and fluffier, you will tend to use the tortillon. Here, as you can see, I'm trying to refine those folds in the fur, And you can see that just by adding some of these darker areas and drawing a few highlights here and there, you can make the fur look a lot fuller and a lot more realistic. Now I have to move on to the hind legs, and this part was a little bit tricky because of the way the cat is standing. But then again, I liked the position that the cat was in, almost as if it were observing a prey or something. It was a very nice picture to draw, so I wanted to capture that as well. And I'm also drawing the tail. The tip or the end of the tail will be a little bit darker, or the fur in that part is a little bit darker. And the fur also has its texture, and because it is so long and it's so flexible, it will also have these folds or creases. Now moving on to drawing these rocks, because the cat is standing on a rock or a cliff. And I already made quite a few videos in which I draw rocks. My approach is always pretty similar. I don't worry too much about what's in the reference photo. I just make these irregular strokes. I try to draw irregular jagged shapes by laying down some of these darker areas, and then I add a little bit of texture on top. And then once I'm happy with the general shape, I just move in with blending tools and I blend them in a little bit. Once I've done blending, I go back in with a charcoal pencil to add a little bit more value where needed in some of these darker areas. And then I go back in with an eraser, either a pencil eraser or a kneaded eraser, to draw highlights so that it looks like some of these rocks are protruding, so that they look more jagged and more sharp and irregular. The thing you need to keep in mind when drawing rocks is that you will have a lot of contrast usually, because whenever you have objects that have sharp, jagged edges, you will tend to have a lot of a range of value between these darker and lighter areas, because some parts of them will be very dark and others will tend to receive a lot more light. And this contrast is very important if you want to create a realistic looking rock. Now I'm softening the texture of the tail. And you can see that the cat is coming along nicely and the fur is really starting to look realistic. I'm still working on the hind legs. There's still a lot of work to be done. This part here between the legs was also a little bit tricky because the hair is supposed to be of lighter color, but then again the area is supposed to be darker because of the shadows. So I initially didn't really know how to shade it. It's a long process where you shade and then remove some value with your erasers and then go back in with your pencil and shade until you're happy with the final outcome. I have to do the rest of this rock using the same approach. It looks pretty quick, but it takes a little bit of practice. Another thing that I wanted to add here were some plants and some grass to the right. But I'm going to do that once I finish with these rocks. So now I started working on those plants, and they're a nice detail in the foreground, but the problem was that I also wanted to draw some highlights near the bottom, but then that would create more contrast, which I didn't really want because I'm trying to fade or blur that part to make it look like a vignette. So I kind of fidgeted with that a little bit for a while until I got it to look the way I want it. I didn't want it to look too detailed. I just wanted a little bit of grass there in the foreground. And that's about it. So you can see it's a very simple scene. We have the mountain in the back, which I did with graphite pencils, with an HB graphite pencil. And you have a cat, which is the focus, which was done mostly with charcoal pencils, the medium one mostly, but now I'm refining some of these edges with a black colored pencil. So I used three kinds of pencils basically. I used charcoal pencils, I used graphite pencils, and I used a little bit of black colored pencil as well. For blending, I used brushes and tortillons, and for erasing and drawing highlights, I used the usual pencil erasers and kneaded erasers. And now I'm just adding a little bit more value and refining the texture on some parts of the cat's body where I didn't think there was enough value. And I also wasn't happy with the edge of this rock. I didn't think it made sense, so I decided to modify it. I darkened this area a little bit to create more contrast with the background, and I think it looks better that way. I also had to work a little bit on the cat's back. I still need to add a little bit of value here and there. And like I said, you need to refine the appearance of the fur a little bit to try to make sure that it's flowing in the proper direction and that it looks really short and coarse in certain areas and fluffy and soft in other areas. I'm just doing some final softening with a brush and blending a little bit, taking away a little bit of value here and there with a kneaded eraser. But the drawing is mostly done. This is what I wanted to accomplish. So I'm pretty happy with the way it looks. I'm just using a brush a little bit here and there just to add a tiny bit of value. This is another advantage of using a brush. You can just use it a little bit to add a little bit of value in some of the lighter areas without spoiling any of the texture. And that's pretty much done. Now all I have left to do is to sign the drawing, and we are done. Thank you for watching.